Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Vasyl Pekhnia. I'm a Ukrainian journalist who is working already more than 3 years observing Ukrainian fronts. And right now I propose you, dear listeners, and those who watch, this live update on Ukrainian battle map as of May 30. So please join to us, subscribe, push your likes buttons and write your comments. Let's start with a very dangerous situation which is right now going on Sumy region, and I will tell if it is really critical or if it's not. Let's start.
Sumy region, that's where we start. And indeed, as I mentioned, all these epithets come to people's minds. Apocalyptic, catastrophic, critical situation. Where did this come from? Essentially, it started when these Russian advances appeared on the deep state map, in particular a partial advance in Vodolahi with the capture of the settlement of Bilovody, and Lokhnia, also a partial capture. Accordingly, 3 more settlements have been added to the 4 that were previously occupied: Vasylivka, Zhuravka, Basivka, and Novenke. As a result, all these settlements are now, so to speak, within the enemy's zone of control. However, I do not consider this situation to be catastrophic, and I'll explain why. Because it is very misleading to present information about settlements and their capture nowadays in the context of such large-scale battles taking place in Ukraine. After all, most of the settlements that are on the line of contact, that are at the front line of the fighting, in fact, no longer exist. Sometimes these are just burned out houses, scorched earth, a lunar landscape, and nothing more. But in people's minds, they are still perceived as settlements. I understand that this may sound very cynical right now to the residents of Sumy region, especially to those for whom all these mentioned settlements are their native places. But in reality, when it comes to an army offensive, and in the case of the Russians in the Sumy direction, we're talking about a full-fledged, at least one combined military army that's up to 50,000 troops. So when we talk about the size of armies and their attacks, well, even last year there was an announcement of a massive Russian offensive. For example, in the Pokrovsk direction, and over the entire year from last summer until now, in the Pokrovsk direction, they have advanced 50 kilometers deep. As of today, in the Sumy region, the entire Russian army over the course of 2 months, and let me remind you, because the Sumy operation did not start yesterday or a week ago, it began 2 months ago in mid-February, when our troops were pushed back from the Kursk bridgehead, and since then the Russians have begun moving along the Sumy border area. Now they are simply intensifying, scaling up, and increasing it. Accordingly, over these 2 months, the Russians' advance into our territory has amounted, at best for them, to 10 kilometers. For example, in the direction of Novenke, Basivka, Lokhnia, it is 10 kilometers. Well, give or take, almost 10 kilometers. In fact, as we can see from a more general perspective, that was kind of an introduction, so to speak. This section here is a sort of bulge into Russian territory. I hope that the Russians won't be able to advance any further than the line where the front is being straightened in this direction. This is basically where the front runs near Yunakivka. Why? Because there a very difficult landscape begins for the Russians. There begins a forested area. In fact, everything south of this settlement, Yunakivka, is already forested terrain. Let me highlight it. Here are all the forests stretching to the north of Sumy. And where there are forests, it means you can only move along roads, highways. Accordingly, these highways will be targeted, at least I sincerely hope so, by our artillery. And there are even some signs of this. Because yesterday I received information from soldiers who are holding the area around the settlement of Khotin. This is right here, Khotin. The Russians, the day before yesterday, wanted to carry out a large-scale attack bypassing Kindrativka towards Khotin with their significant resources, but this did not happen. Why didn't it happen? Because our wonderful uncle Himars, our multiple launch rocket system, which has now been in the hands of the Ukrainian armed forces for 3 years, worked very effectively and precisely in this direction. According to reports from fighters in the Sumy region, a concentration of enemy forces preparing for an attack was targeted. By the way, it wasn't just infantry there, not just infantry with motorcycles, which is how the Russians have been attacking lately, but there were also clusters of equipment. I think that very soon we will see the first videos that will appear after this Himars strike, because the fighters from the area report that it hit very hard and very accurately. So that's the first story. The depth of the enemy's advance is not that significant. Second, where they will now begin to advance, if they still manage to fulfill their objective of advancing toward Yunakivka, forest roads will begin, along which artillery should be working. Third, friends, the Russians are not doing anything overly complicated, no particularly skillful or super sophisticated infantry maneuvers. They are simply scorching our positions with maximum enemy fire, aviation, and drone strikes. The same goes for Vodolahi, Bilovody, Loknya, and before that, Basivka, a village that no longer exists, Vasylivka, Zhuravka, Novenke. It's the same story. Villages are being wiped out practically to nothing. What does this mean? It means that in such conditions, when you are holding the defense, well, it's impossible to just stand there and endure it when a barrage of shells is coming down on you. In that case, it's not about kilometers on the map, but about thousands of the lives of our servicemen. Not just our servicemen, but someone's fathers, someone's brothers, someone's husbands. Accordingly, a dynamic defense, including in this direction, must be conducted. Sometimes it is necessary to withdraw from certain locations in order to inflict massive fire damage on the enemy elsewhere. Because in the same Pokrovsk direction, the result of last year's Russian offensive was an advance of 50 kilometers inland. Some might say, wow, that's incredible. 50 kilometers is a lot. But for that advance, the Russians lost up to 400,000 of their soldiers. Is that a lot or a little? I think that someday historians, God willing, Ukraine will win this war. Someday historians will write about this 50-kilometer advance and the cost of 400,000 of their servicemen's lives killed and wounded. So what will historians say? Was this a successful operation or an unsuccessful one? Accordingly, here as well, we cannot hold out endlessly until the last soldier. It's simply, well, unthinkable and illogical to hold certain positions. It's necessary to retreat, delaying the enemy, destroying them, and then moving to certain channeled sections of the defense. What does channeled mean? It means when a broad offensive is narrowed down to certain very tight areas, like the neck of a bottle. That's where things like Himars and our artillery need to start working very, very actively and effectively. That's what I'm expecting. And this will happen starting roughly from Yunakivka. Although the Russians still need to reach the lines of Yunakivka and Yablunivka first. Here are Yunakivka, Yablunivka, and Oleksivka. They still need to get here. However, there are indeed certain threats here. There are particular threats that are worth worrying about. And this personally concerns me. This is the settlement of Khotin and nearby Pysarivka. What are the risks here? As I already mentioned, the Russians are trying and intend to carry out attacks here. And these attempts and attacks here put the entire northern supply route at risk, as it passes directly through Khotin, Pysarivka, and then on to Yunakivka and all our other defensive positions. In fact, the enemy's advance here puts the entire northern area at risk of being cut off, the very area through which the Russians are moving. This is the second threat that exists. Number 3, what are the Russians actually planning to do here in the Sumy region? As of today, the city of Sumy itself, the regional center, is not threatened by an enemy infantry assault, but it does face a number of other threats related to logistics. Let's take a look even on this broader overview of the map. I'll show you Sumy, where it is located at the center of these events. There are 4 highways leading to it from the direction where the enemy could advance. The first one goes through Myopilia. In fact, it's no coincidence that evacuation of the population was carried out here in advance, and right here in the area of Tayotkin, the armed forces of Ukraine conducted their offensive operations in order to tie down enemy troops in this location and prevent them from advancing from the direction of Myopilia as well. Besides Myopilia, the second route runs from Sudzha through Khotin and Pysarivka to Sumy. The third route comes from Krasnopilia and from the east, from the southeast to Sumy. And the fourth is here in the Myopilia area. another route that converges in Khotin, also in this region. So, in fact, there are 4 routes that the Russians want to bring under fire control and begin to blockade Sumy. In other words, essentially start a full-scale operation to encircle this settlement. As of today, the Russians have not entered or advanced into Myopilia. Why? Because right here in the area of Tyotkino, a Ukrainian operation is underway. There are certain concerns and risks regarding Krasnopilia because, for example, in the area where a similar operation was carried out as in Tyotkino, in Demidivka and Hrafivka near Uhroidi, to neutralize the enemy's advantage, now the enemy may try to strike here towards Uhroidi and Krasnopilia with the aim once again of cutting off this route. But it was precisely for this purpose that the previous operation was carried out, to block the possibility of an advance or to tie down enemy forces and prevent them from moving toward one of the highways. The greatest dangers now are along the route from Yunakivka to Khotin. But as I said, this is a wooded area, and here essentially this single route channels our defense, which is actually quite good. And the 4th location that is also under threat here is the Myopilia area. From Myopilia, the Russians can realistically enter from the Huivi-Myopilia area. But precisely to prevent this from happening, there is still a small holding of bridgeheads in the Kursk region near Huive in order to deny the Russians the opportunity to advance fully and calmly toward Myopilia. So once again, enemy troops are being pinned down in a 3rd location, which is precisely where the highway is. But I do not rule out that the Russians might still manage to push through here to get into the area of Myopilia and further on at the lines near Mokritsi and Hrunivka. Well, Mohritsia and Hrunivka, the forests begin again, just like in Yunakivka. The wooded terrain will help us once again to channel the defense with the aim of destroying the enemy in these, let's call them, bloody cauldrons. That is why, understanding this logic of defense, I see no reason to panic. I definitely see no reason to panic. I see no reason to call the situation apocalyptic, but I do see certain threats. Yes, these threats obviously exist, and the Russians are creating them, because the grouping of troops, while not the largest, 60,000 troops is not a small number, still with such a force, they are basically incapable of blocking 4 highways at once in order to advance on a broad front, and only an advance on a broad front makes sense. In order to exert pressure on a broad front, the Russians would need to assemble at least 150 to 200,000 troops here as a force, a strike fist in the Sumy region. Most likely, the Russians will advance their 10 kilometers, just as they did last year in the Kharkiv region, and will declare that they have accomplished their objectives, that they have created a buffer zone, and basically, that's all there is to expect.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
But that's how I see the situation as of today. It could get worse, it could get better. We'll see how things unfold. That the Russians will be creating pressure points here in certain areas is beyond doubt. Now, I'm sure someone in the comments will write, wait a minute, you said there were no threats. I'm telling you, friends, and if you want, you can look up the archives of my speeches. What I'm saying is that in certain locations where the enemy has gathered troops, they can create specific threats, like, for example, the Yunakivka area. That's exactly the kind of threat I was talking about. But to talk about a full-scale, full-fledged creation of what Putin called a buffer zone is inappropriate and misguided, because as of today, our entire northern border, which the Russian dictator refers to when he talks about the need to create a buffer zone here, is approximately 750 kilometers wide. That is, starting from Chernihiv region, continuing through Sumy region and ending with Kharkiv, it is 750 kilometers, a front line of 750 kilometers. In order to talk about any potential concept like a buffer zone, we need to talk about advancing 20 kilometers deep. And if you multiply 20 by 750, if I'm not mistaken, that comes out to 15,000 square kilometers. I always cite this figure, 15,000 square kilometers. The Russians don't even come close to having the resources needed to carry out full-scale blocking actions at such a distance. But in certain spots, there is, of course, danger and threat. They exist in the north of the Kharkiv region as well. Right now, more and more information is coming in that in this section of the Kharkiv border area, the Russians trying to stretch our defenses are attacking. They are attacking so far unsuccessfully, but it is possible that in the future they will have more opportunities to advance further into our border area, because the front line does not run along the border. The front is established along advantageous lines and for holding positions. This is where the front is being established. It does not run along the state border. Here the Russians will try to penetrate deeper into our defenses. For what purpose? In order to stretch this defense and carry out an operation to put pressure on Kupiansk, that same Kupiansk which they have been pressing on here for a good 2 years already, but still cannot capture. Okay, maybe not 2, but about 1.5. Having come practically right up to Kupiansk, they still cannot take it. So what preparatory work did they do earlier? In fact, the Russians have created 3 bridgeheads here. The first is a bridgehead on the left bank of the Oskil River, centered around Kupiansk itself. The second bridgehead, they are now trying to isolate it like this, is centered in Borova. Here is Borova and here is Kupiansk. And the third bridgehead, which they are once again now planning, forming along the left bank of the Oskil, centered in Lyman. Why is this necessary? In order to split what was once a large bridgehead on the left bank of the Oskil into 3, to divide this elephant into 3 smaller pieces and consume it one at a time. So in the immediate meal the Russians are eyeing, their ambition is specifically for Kupiansk. To this end, they will be stretching the Kharkiv northern border area. We'll see what comes of it. In my personal opinion, which I have held for a long time and consistently, the greatest threats to Ukraine exist in the Donbass, particularly in the area and sector of Kostiantynivka. Why Donbass, you might ask? Because Donbass is the enemy's strategic objective and goal. Capturing the borders of Donetsk region is, again, their strategic goal. In order for this to happen, we need to talk about taking control of the Slovyansk-Kramatorsk and Drushkivka-Kostiantynivka agglomerations. To carry out this operation, they have to start with something smaller. They need to start with Kostiantynivka. It is precisely here that the enemy is now directing its main reserves and resources, focusing its primary attention, and unfortunately has created this expansion along the Pokrovsk, Mirnohrad, Kostiantynivka highway, pushing into our defenses. This is a dangerous situation. Why do I talk about this in almost every stream? Because from here, the enemy can advance toward Dobropilia. Dobropilia, which is now a key location connecting Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka. The route passes through it. The enemy can also move toward Pokrovsk together with Mirnohrad. The enemy can also advance toward Kostiantynivka from here. The integrity of the defense in this direction has been compromised, so there are very significant risks and dangers. In addition, in the direction of Kostiantynivka, the enemy is now putting pressure on Chasiv Yar, has occupied most of the northern districts of Chasiv Yar, and is pressing from the south along the highway between Bakhmut and Kostiantynivka. But for now, this pressure is not yet as intense as it could possibly be, because I'm convinced that it will reach its peak over the next month, most likely, since the enemy needs to synchronize the offensive in parallel along all possible, let's say, directions. This could mean pressure on Pokrovsk. It could also be simultaneous pressure on Kostiantynivka. This could be parallel pressure from the Turkish agglomeration. There will be pressure on Chasiv Yar, and there will be pressure here on the Siversk section of the front. And it is not out of the question that there could be pressure from Bakhmut towards Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. That is in order to synchronize all these actions. And of course, let's not forget the Lyman direction itself, which is currently also among the most active areas from the enemy's side. Accordingly, in order to synchronize this pressure, the enemy is now preparing its reserves, and the situation at the front will become somewhat more difficult in terms of enemy pressure. And here, right here, when it comes to Donbass, I personally have the greatest concerns. I'm not worried or anxious about the north, not about the Kharkiv region, not about the Kupiansk area, but about what will happen in the Donetsk direction. What should be done in such a situation? probably the very first thought that comes to mind is that we still need to finalize, although it can't be done very quickly, but we need to finalize as soon as possible the processes of creating core for the Ukrainian army. What will this achieve? It will provide clarity in the command of our units along the front lines, and it will also bring these directions under a single technological standard, a single technological denominator, as well as a unified command denominator. Similarly, by the way, it will also unify, let's say, the level of skills and abilities. That is, in the context of training, drills, and the units assigned or attached to the newly created corps. Because in every corps, there is, in particular, a certain leading flagship unit or brigade that is supposed to establish the highest standards, which all other units within the corps should strive to reach. Accordingly, based on this, I really expect that this structural change will bring many positives for our army, because we have, for example, areas where even without the creation of corps, quite significant stabilization has already been achieved. For example, let's say the area of Bohatiriak, Constantinople, Rozliv, Andriivka. The situation in this sector, despite the fact that the enemy is advancing here and has made some progress, has remained relatively stable over the past few months. Although it was precisely here that the first breach in our defense could have been created, I call it an abscess in our defense, back at the beginning of this year. As of now, thanks to the combined firepower of all the brigades here, their unification under a single command, let's say a single leadership, and the pooling of all the brigades' fire resources, it has been possible to stabilize this direction and hold back the enemy as much as is possible in our current circumstances. In addition, just yesterday, the commander of this sector, the local Vuledar group of forces, Serhinayev, wrote on his Telegram channel that this approach has led to a reduction in personnel losses by about 15%. And that is, well, about the most valuable thing. It's about the lives of our servicemen whose numbers on the front line are already at a critical level. Accordingly, this approach needs to be scaled up to a greater number of Ukrainian units, including within the corps. After all, in the current situation we are in, there are actually no other ways to fight against the enemy's vastly superior forces. Here it's either additional resources, which, as we understand, we don't have many of at the moment. That is, we can't just suddenly get money from somewhere to produce billions of drones. We are producing the quantity we aimed for this year, those 3 to 4 million, and that's what we're making. But apart from drones, we can't immediately produce hundreds of missiles right now because the money is only just starting to come in, particularly from the European Union and from Germany. There are joint projects that are now emerging in Ukraine, and here it's not just about production and money. It's also about improving certain technological equipment so that these missiles are operational. For example, yesterday information appeared from the German publication Welt, which stated that Germany is now effectively investing 5 billion euros, including in missile programs, BAR's drone missiles, our long-range Lyuti drones and interceptor drones, so-called anti-aircraft drones, which make it possible to shoot down both Shaheds and Russian reconnaissance drones. Accordingly, in order for this program to be implemented, it will take some time. It can't happen right away. So, in our case, there are two options. Either it's a rapid increase in resources, including, by the way, people, not just drones, missiles, or any other equipment, but also people, because we can't just find tens of thousands of mobilized individuals in Ukraine and immediately send them to the front. That's simply unrealistic because people need to be trained, and frankly speaking, there aren't that many willing volunteers to be found. So it's either resources or the pooling of resources. Where we don't have the ability to get more resources, we need to combine the resources we have and purposefully strike at the channel defense. In other words, to force the enemy to narrow down in certain areas to a single, so to speak, route, to a single location that we have already targeted and where we will destroy them, let's say, on an industrial scale. These are the tasks that, in essence, are currently achievable and feasible from the perspective of our defense in the enemy's current summer campaign. It's a difficult task, but it is not impossible. That's how things stand. Friends, thank you for your attention. Take care of yourselves. All the best, and until we meet again.